Hello everyone, welcome to another video. We'll be continuing our discussion on interest rates. Specifically, we'll be discussing how we determine the nominal interest rate. It's really a sum of our real interest rate plus our inflation rate. We'll also determine some other factors that affect our interest rates, which is our two premiums, both the default premium and the maturity premium. And finally, we'll be looking at our interest rates really on our yield curve, understanding what some of the implications of certain curves. So, nominal rates. We'll start with nominal risk-free rate. Okay, so this is really the rate that you would earn if you made really the safest investment you could make, which is pretty much investing in a bank or some sort of government security. Okay, so treasury security. Now, we earn money on our investment, obviously by earning interest, okay? But we can also think of it as being paid for giving up a certain amount of money for a certain amount of time, okay? So in other words, if we invest in a GIC, a guaranteed investment certificate, which is really the Canadian equivalent of a CD, and let's say we invest for a year, we're giving up that money for a year. So that's why we're getting compensated by that. Now, another thing we have to think about, though, is understanding how inflation plays a role in that interest rate. Okay, so we need to come up with some sort of equation that will show the relationship between these variables. Well, that's what the Fisher picture is all about. Okay, and we have the Fisher effect. Okay, now so this gentleman, he figured out the relationship between the real rate of interest, the inflation rate, and the nominal interest rate. And we kind of conclude with the idea that figuring out the nominal rate is just understanding the real rate plus inflation. We also have to consider the cross product of the real rate and inflation if we were looking for the true nominal rate. But sometimes you might notice that this is left out here because it's kind of small, but it's just a good reminder that we have to also consider that the real rate of interest is relevant to the inflation as well. Okay, but sometimes you might just look or trying to calculate the approximate nominal rate, which is just R star plus H. Okay, but ultimately the Fisher effect helps us understand how interest rates and expected inflation rates move in tandem. Okay, so inflation rate moves up, we expect that our interest rate would also increase as well. Now let's consider two really other factors, other premiums. Okay, so far we've only talked about nominal risk-free rate. So yes, if we're investing in safe investments such as investing in a bank or the government, we really have to only worry about the R star and the H. Okay. However, we might want to make other investments. Okay. Now, some more interesting or more riskier investments, and what we mean by interesting is that these investments might have a higher rate of return. Okay. Now, with any investment with a higher rate of return, we have to expect to pay or to expect to incur some more risk. Okay. So this is what we mean by the two premiums. So the first risk that we must really incur is the default risk premium. Okay, so this premium exists basically at the risk of the borrower, okay, not being able to pay back the interest and the principal. Okay, so this is where we would expect to get some sort of compensation for this risk. And another risk we have to think about is the maturity risk premium. So this maturity risk premium basically exists for the length of time that the loan will be outstanding. Okay, so in other words, the longer you loan out your money, the more you should be compensated, right? So ultimately, again, if we're making more riskier investments, there has to be a bigger payout, a bigger return. So that's where these premiums help us understand, again, now we're looking at a higher return, a higher nominal interest rate that we should expect to earn if we make an investment in such riskier investments. Now, it's obviously important to understand the different types of investments. Okay, We'll look at an example here. Okay, so if we're comparing a corporate bond, right, which is basically just another example of loaning money to a company. Okay, if you bought a bond, okay, versus a treasury bond, which is basically investing in the government. Okay, now notice in both cases they're both 30 years, so we don't have to worry about the maturity premium because they're both similar. Okay, but we can, when we're dealing with the default premium, we should think about, well, which one do you think has a higher default premium? Again, who's more likely to go out of business? Who's more likely not to be able to pay back their loan? Is it a corporation or the government? Well, obviously depending on the government it makes a difference, but if you are comparing any corporation to the government, you know that the government is going to stay in business. It's very unlikely that they won't be able to pay back. So because of that, we can expect that the overall return, okay, all other things being equal, the overall return on the or nominal return on the corporate bond should be higher than the nominal return on the treasury bond. Okay, so this is what we mean by 30-year-old corporate bond being greater. Okay, the return is greater than the T bond. Okay, so again, why is it? Well, because there's a higher default risk. Okay, so that's really going back to the logic with higher risk means higher reward. All right. Now, again, some theory for you just to see it illustrated, very similar to what we've been saying. Okay, in order to calculate the nominal, we need to move from just the real rate and add inflation, right? So again, an example of a risk-free real rate would be the risk or the real rate plus inflation. So a treasury bill is a good example because again, we're just making a short-term investment in the government. Okay, we know we're going to get that money back. It's a pretty good investment in terms of low risk. Okay, however, if we want a more riskier investment, well, if we look on this arrow here, we can maybe get something, maybe invest in some sort of company. So there will definitely be some sort of default premium that's associated in terms of risk. So yes, this is a less riskier investment, but this investment, even though there's more risk associated, we can expect a higher rate of return. Okay, so again, just to see the options that you have and recognize the different dimensions of interest rates, how they're actually determined. Okay, and you can see how risk and really inflation play a role in how we determine what our interest rates look like. Now let's move on to yield curves. Okay, so yield curves really represents a relationship between two things. Okay, and that's really the interest rate. Okay, so in this case, again, we use the word yield, interest rate, or the rate sort of interchangeably. Okay, but really we're looking at the rates versus the maturity dates. Okay, so in other words, how long you invest your money for, what type of rate or what type of yield can you expect. Okay, so this is what we mean by a yield curve. And really a financial instrument is just another way of saying an investment opportunity. So let's say you're investing in a bond. Okay, again, depending on how long you invest that bond, what type of yield do you expect? Okay, so that's maturity is really, think of it as terms of time versus the return on that time. Okay, now 3 different types of curves that we'll discuss. And again, it can get a little complicated, but we'll just think about the general implications of each. And maybe if some of you taking some economics, this might ring some bells. So first is the normal yield curve. Okay, and you can see it's considered upward sloping. Now this is the most common, and this is what is expected. And hopefully we can start to understand why it's what we would expect. Okay, again, thinking about what we just learned about. If we look at it in terms of time, okay, so here is a very short investment. Okay, if we make a short investment, well, what type of, do we expect a big yield on that short investment? No, usually we expect a short investment is a less riskier investment, means a less rewarding, less yielding investment. So that makes sense. Now, if we compare making an investment maybe somewhere around here on the curve, here you can see that this is a very long-term investment. Okay, so there's probably a maturity premium associated with that investment. In other words, you can expect, right, if I made an investment for such a longer period, I would expect to get a higher yield on my investment compared to the short-term investment here, okay? So this is really what we see here on the yield curve. This is what we're plotting here, okay? Which is normal. It makes sense, right? Again, the logic is, as we stated, the longer the loan, the longer the wait for repayment, and the higher the interest rate on the loan, okay? So this makes sense. This is what we expect. And this usually indicates, the implication is that the economy is doing well. We're not worrying about higher interest rates. We expect a good positive outlook for the economy, okay? Now, sometimes when there's a less of a positive outlook on the economy, we might start to see a flat yield curve, okay? And really what this, what this kind of means is that the reward for a short-term investment versus a long-term investment is pretty much the same. There's really no difference between that, okay? Now, why this sometimes happens, it could be a couple things, but for instance, what might be happening is that the interest rates are increasing so much that really the difference is negligible in terms of the maturity premium, okay? So remember, how did we calculate interest rates? Well, it's the risk-free rate plus inflation plus maturity premium. But if inflation is so high, then the gap between the short-term investments and the long-term investments are not very big, okay? And that's why we start to see a flattening of the yield curve. And sometimes when inflation gets very high, that shows that investors are not very confident in the future. They don't think that the outlook for the economy is going to be very good. So they start to consider or kind of prefer to keep their money invested for a longer period of time. So even though there's not much difference, they still want to keep their money invested for a longer period of time, even though short term is pretty much the same payoff. Okay. Now, if this continues, this is what might happen, which is not great. This is an inverted yield curve. Okay. Now, what does this tell us? Well, again, if we look at the investments here, what it's actually showing us is that despite the fact that short-term investments have a higher yield, okay, than long-term investments. So again, this is very counter sort of intuitive to what we've kind of learned about. For some reason, investors still want to keep their money invested in long-term. There's actually still more demand to invest your money in for a longer period of time, okay? Now, why would that be the case? What are the implications of that? Well, what this usually means, and history can show us this, is that this shows that the economy is going to continue to do very poorly. There might even be a recession coming up, okay? So investors actually want to protect themselves. They want to preserve their capital. And if they suspect that the economy is going to do poorly, then they sort of, in a sense, they kind of want to ride out the storm. So they want to keep their money invested. They don't want their money to come out, okay? So it actually drives longer maturity bonds prices to go up and the yields go down, okay? So there's actually more demand for longer longer yielding bonds. And despite the fact that there's more demand, well, because there's more demand, that means the prices go up and it's actually not as valuable, okay? So the yields actually go down. And don't worry, we'll spend a little bit more time on this when we start valuing bonds. But for now, just understand that when we see a downward sloping curve, that is a sign that the economy could get even worse, okay? And investors, if they know that, if they think that, then they actually want to keep their money in for longer, okay? And what's very interesting is that in these cases, it actually is a better strategy, surprisingly enough, is to keep your money in longer rather than making short-term investments, even though the yield is higher. Now, if that sounds kind of strange, then I strongly recommend that you watch this video, okay, on the inverted yield curve. Very good example. And this actually helps us understand and examines how you can actually maximize value by investing at a lower rate and it helpful in the long run, okay? So great video to watch. Good sort of follow-up for the yield curves. But that's our time for today. We've looked at these three objectives. Thanks for watching and happy financing.